Liability is fundamental in every contract. Sally Mewies is going to help us understand the recent trends in the law. Sally, why is liability such an important issue in contract law?
Well, liability is an important issue, David, because it's really at the heart of risk allocation in any contractual relationship. So what liability says is, in a scenario where something's gone wrong, there's a breach of contract, or somebody suffered a loss, then the liability provisions will determine who takes what responsibility for that loss.
Tell me about the underlying principles.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because quite often people think that if they're actually an innocent person in a breach of contract scenario, that they can recover absolutely every aspect of loss that they might incur. That's not the case. It's absent a written contract. Even at common law, we have rules that govern how much you can recover if you're a victim of a breach of contract. And those rules determine the types and kinds of losses that can be recoverable, and we call that the rules on remoteness.
What is an indemnity?
Yes, what is an indemnity, David? And that's a very interesting question, because people often think that the word indemnity has a specific legal meaning. And in fact, it's not like other phrases like subject to contract and time of the essence, because it doesn't really have a specific meaning. It's really however it's used in the context of a contract. That's a slightly flippant answer, I guess, because we do, in commercial contracts, use indemnity in two scenarios. So we use it in the insurance sense. So if I have to pay £10 to you, then one of my partners will reimburse that £10. That's sort of an insurance-style indemnity. But we also use it in a breach of contract scenario. So we might say, if you breach this contract with me, then you will indemnify me against all of the losses that I suffer as a result of that.
Sally, what's the recent case law on indemnities?
Well, I don't think there's been any recent case law that's particularly interesting around indemnities. But I think the point that's coming out more strongly as every case we see is this idea that where you use an indemnity mechanism for a breach of contract, that the judge and the courts are going to construe that very narrowly. So they're not seeing an indemnity for breach of contract as an open check. You can just recover absolutely all of your losses. They will construe those narrowly.
Is there a new test for remoteness?
Well, it's a very interesting time, I think, in contract law around all of this, David, because in the last few years, we've had some cases that have suggested that those very old cases you remember from your college days of Hadley and Baxendale and Victoria Laundry may have been altered or extended slightly. And if you remember, those cases were all about what was in the reasonable contemplation of the parties as likely to happen. And what recent cases have been saying is, well, you've just got to tack something on the end of that test and say, well, yeah, okay, something might fall within the rules of remoteness on those old cases, but have you assumed responsibility for that loss? And if you have or haven't, will determine whether actually you're liable. So it is an interesting time, and it's still very much the developing area, I think.
What is the difference between direct and indirect loss?
Well, direct loss is those losses that were in the reasonable contemplation of the parties as not unlikely to happen. So they're those things that arise naturally in the ordinary course of things as a result of the breach. And the key thing around that is to understand that that's very much an objective test. So it's about imputed knowledge. It's not necessarily the things that you were told about or you thought about. It's what you ought to have thought about or known about if you'd sat down for a minute and giving it some thought. So actually that's a quite large pool of loss. Whereas indirect losses are losses that don't fall into that quite big category of loss, but which you were told about as sort of special circumstances, and as a result of that you're then liable. So the indirect loss piece is in fact quite narrow.
What are the three main things that in-house lawyers should bear in mind about liability?
I think the three things for me is understand when you use the word indemnity that you really need to spell out very clearly in the contract what you mean, especially if you're trying to use it in a breach of contract scenario, because it won't automatically denote those consequences you think, i.e. allow you to recover absolutely every last pound of loss, no matter how ludicrous or unlikely. Understand that the direct loss piece is a large pool of losses, and actually the indirect loss isn't, and use that to your advantage. If you have to accept liability for certain things, think about that, and it might be a useful negotiating position. And thirdly, again, understand that this direct loss pool is actually quite a large pool of losses, and that there's a lot in that. So when you accept liability for that, you're not necessarily keeping your liability narrow, and that indirect loss is probably fairly narrow and unlikely, I guess, in most scenarios to be an issue.